Okay.
And then probably the best thing to do, actually, instead of Jack, you recording, just if you want to share it on a public drive, like a Google Drive,
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. I will. Yeah.
you do it that way.
Zoom
That's
itself
also
has
great.
cloud storage for the recording, so this is
Hmm.
recording now, and I'll post that on the meetup page. Great.
Yep.
All right. So, so today we are going to talk about some Drupal site architecture. So this will be about the process that we go through in my company when we have a project that has been specified to some degree. We know what we want to build, and we have to determine um, how to wire up the site to make it do what is being asked of us. Um, so what we are going to cover today is that we are going to go over a little bit of terminology. So this talk is not going to assume too much knowledge of Drupal. This is going to be a little bit more introductory level from that perspective. So I'm going to go over through a little bit of the terminology and then which of those are going to be most relevant to us in the process of deciding what the architecture is going to be for a site. We're going to talk a little bit about how you look at an existing site and map that onto Drupal features so that you can make a plan. And we're going to do that using a real world example, which is a site that Jack has been maintaining in Drupal 7 that I'm going to talk about the process of looking at that existing site and figuring out how we would do that from scratch using some best practices in Drupal 8.
Fantastic.
So what we won't cover today, because there's a lot more that we can talk about, we're not going to talk about the first thing that we would do in my company, which would be to go through some exercises with the client to figure out whether the branding is appropriate. We would discover user stories and figure out what the various needs are, and talk about usability of the current site and how that would be. We're going to assume that all of that has been done, or to the degree that it's appropriate for the scale of the project. For a hobbyist project, obviously, there's less of that happens. We're going to assume we have a pretty good handle on what the site needs to be before this process. We're not going to talk about the technical aspects of getting a Drupal site running, or writing migrations from content from the old site to the new site, how to select which contributed modules to use and audit them for suitability, writing custom module code, doing your own theming and presentation, where to host the site, and how to do the DevOps infrastructure that would support it. So there's a lot of other surrounding pieces. We're just going to focus on the conceptual side of things, making the decisions and the Lego part of snapping together the different pieces that make up a site. That's enough to get you started on getting something functional that you can start putting content in, and something that is a site, and then everything else enhances that. So the first thing we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, is some terminology. Um, so there are two hard problems in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors. Naming things is really hard because when you come up with a name, the thing that you're naming tends to change over time, and the name becomes less suitable, but you're kind of stuck with it because it's in all of your APIs, it's in your code everywhere, it's in all of your marketing materials or your documentation. And so the names we find aren't always the most obvious. So fundamentally, when someone's designing something like a CMS, they have to come up with a name for what a thing is, So what were the things in Drupal? When Drupal started off originally, it was designed to be effectively a feature by feature replacement for Slashdot, for a blogging platform, effectively a news platform. So it was a university project, by one person. And so a lot of the decisions were how do we effectively make a chronological listing of stories that different people can contribute and can be commented on and categorized. So the main things were nodes, terms, users, and comments. And there were some other things too, like books, which still kind of exists as a little vestigial organ on the back of Drupal that people don't tend to use. And the most of those, well, users and comments are pretty obvious words. Terms and nodes a little less so. So node is a piece of content fundamentally. The idea there was to envision all of the content on a site as a graph, in the mathematical graph theory sense. So you have circles with lines connecting them, and the nodes being those circles. So that is the idea, is that the content on a Drupal site is a web of connected things, and those things we're going to call nodes. But then we want to categorize those things. So there was an idea of a taxonomy, which is split up into vocabularies which contain terms. So originally, those were kind of the four building blocks. And largely speaking, they continue to this day, but they're far from alone anymore. So as Drupal matured, the developers realized, hey, these things have commonalities between them. Nodes and terms, they both have a name, they both have a description. We might want to put some custom fields on them, things like that. And you know what? Users have a name, and we might want to put some custom fields on those, like a user's address. And so these things all have some things in common. It would be nice to not repeat ourselves so much. So we need another name. We need a name for a thing that represents all of these. And we already used node, which we already used because it was kind of an abstract name for a thing. So what's our new thing? We can't use object because that'll be confusing for programmers, because other things are objects. So the word that they came up with for that is entities. So in Drupal 6, the idea of an entity was introduced, didn't really have much useful you could do with it until Drupal 7, where most of those things were entities. Now in Drupal 8, entities have become even more fundamental. Even more things are types of entities. And in fact, there are two different kinds of entities. There are now content entities and configuration entities. So this next slide, this is from the Drupal API. I just went to content entity interface, which is the interface that all of the content entities inherit from. And I stripped out all of the tests. And so what we're left with is these are all of the content entities that Drupal core, without any contributed modules at all, these are the ones that are available to us. So we'll see some familiar ones, like we've got node here. We have things like a taxonomy term right there. We have users. There are also some things that you might not have considered right away. We've got files as well as media, which are kind of wrappers for files, but they could also be wrappers for external things like remote video. Then we have entities like path aliases, which you wouldn't normally think of as a main piece of content, but it is content in its own way. So these are all the types of information that are wrapped under the name entity. Then we have bundles. So what's a bundle? This is another funky word. Bundles are effectively groups of content entities that have something in common. So a good example of this is a content type. If you have a news story and a press release, those will both be nodes, and they have all the same features as a node, but they'll have some differences, probably some different fields on them. So a bundle is you can think of it as a subcategorization of a type of entity. So a bundle is defined as a configuration entity. And so let's look at what a configuration entity is. So this is the same thing I did. Oh, I'm in the wrong slide. There we go. You did the same thing as content entities with configuration entities, and you can see that the list is a lot longer, and therefore it is tiny. If you squint, you can see things, but basically you could find this for yourself by going to the Drupal API site and looking at content config entity interface. But I just wanted to highlight the breadth of what's happening here. We have things like content types are in here. We have menus, we have vocabularies, we've got views, which we'll talk about a little bit more, our type of configuration. Yeah, here's node type here, media type, we have image styles, we have visual editors, contact forms, all that stuff are all in there as different config entities. So why do we care? So config entities allow us to put our site together, to define the structure of the site so that content editors can go in there and make pieces of content, make content entities. So fundamentally, the Drupal site architecture we're going to talk about today is the process of thinking about content entities, designing the content entities, so that later we can use that understanding of the site to create the configuration entities that power them. So when we're done, we will have created some configuration entities that define how the site fits together, and then our authors will be empowered to create the content entities. In practice, it's a little blurrier than that, because there are some weird cases where it's not clear whether something should be considered content or configuration. A good example of this are blocks on a site. You can make blocks that are pieces of content that live. Typical example would be in the sidebar of the site on every page, or in the footer on every page. Let's say as a copyright disclaimer in the footer of every page. Well, that copyright disclaimer is clearly content. That's something that could be edited. But the fact that you put it in the footer, that's configuration. because you're deciding how the site is built. So there's some weird overlaps sometimes, but by and large, if you have in your head that content is something that an author does and configuration is something that a developer or administrator does, you've got a good sense of that split. So today we're going to talk about how do we get to the point where we can define that configuration. So the questions we're going to ask are, which entity types do we need? So the entity types are, again, the configuration entities that define things like content, users, that kind of stuff. What relationships tie those together? What listings need to be derived from those relationships? What makes this CMS more powerful than just making a bunch of web pages is that we want to be able to automate some stuff. So we're going to automate listings of content based on the relationships we define. And then what functionality beyond just viewing things do we need to have? And that's where we're going to step beyond what we'll have time to talk about today. But we'll talk a little bit about, as we go through our demo site, we're going to call out things that might be custom functionality. And those are things that would be hopefully often result in just using a contributed module. That's a great outcome, but it could also be custom code that we would write. So that brings me to the end of my prepared slides, because I've set up what we're going to do as the exercise for the rest of our time, which is going to be, again, to look at a site and go through these ideas and figure out how to architect this thing. So this is the website, and we're going to kind of take a little tour through it and find things that look like they would be good candidates for different content types and the other types of features on a Drupal site. So let's just click through a little bit. And at this point, Jack, feel free to jump in, since you know this site. Anytime that you see anything that you think is worth talking about in terms of the content that exists. Yep. So what I see here on the home page, first off,
Muted there. Do you want to talk about it just as it exists?
yeah, just as it exists now.
Not as I think it should be.
Well, I guess both are fine. Yeah.
I was just going to interject that this was done in a church that has a very elderly membership, and the content was originally laid out over a decade ago, actually. It was done back in the day, you know, and real traditional kinds of things. And as far as I'm concerned, it is so wrong today, because the front page, the home page, should be something that's very dynamic, probably changes weekly, maybe even daily, who knows, and that sort of thing. So I've got all kinds of things in mind, but as you know, I think maybe only you, we lost our developer on this about 3 years ago. And I am definitely not a Drupal developer. I've been trying to learn, but and I can administer it fairly effectively. But you said a mouthful. I'll just comment and then I'll get out of your way. But you said a mouthful for me about 10 minutes ago when you commented about what you do is you begin with the content and then you design the configuration around that. I think this website, as I look back at what our developer did, was done in just the reverse order. And it's a large part of the problem today.
Yeah, and that's not uncommon especially for people who are newer to the software. You figure out what it can do for you, and then you try to make the content fit what was done, what's easy to do.
Exactly. That's what happened here.
Yeah. So Well, so one tool or technique, I guess, is to consider the site from the bottom up instead of the top down. And this is counterintuitive to people who are thinking about this from a design perspective, because if you ask a graphic designer, make a design for this web page, the first thing they're going to do is give you a home page, which is fantastic for giving you the feel of the site. And it's obviously a very important component of the site because it's what people see first, but it's probably the least useful thing in determining what the architecture of the site should be. Because ideally, the homepage is driven by a whole bunch of individual pieces of content that you're putting together. You're not doing it all by hand. So if we think about this as a tree structure, we're going to look at the leaves of the tree first. So a common page, this is going to be in almost every site you build, is going to have some sort of just basic content page. So we can, let's see, so we'll just say a basic page. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and change from my fancy video app to a regular Zoom screen share just to make it a little bigger, because I'm done with my slides. And I'm going to go in here and share screen. All right, that'll be a little bigger. Okay, so we got our basic page, and what I'm going to build here is, well, if we want to be really fancy about it, we can call it an entity relationship diagram. Really, it's not, I mean, people who actually make those things would scoff at this, because all I'm going to do is make some boxes and draw some lines between them. But this way we can keep an eye on the different kinds of things we're building and how they fit together. And I'll zoom in as much as I can right now, and then zoom out as, oops, apparently that zoom is a very bad idea because I don't know where I ended up on the page. Okay, here. So we're going to start with this, and I'll zoom out as needed if we have a lot of things to talk about. Okay, so a basic page. Basic page needs pretty much what's out of the box. Now, actually, Drupal will give you a page content type when you start up. You can use that. We tend not to. We tend to make our own basic page content type without using the out-of-the-box body field, just to give ourselves a little bit of flexibility. Because again, the out-of-the-box one has things like a summary, because it's assuming that you're going to have really a news story that has teasers and things like that. And that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about just a free-form basic page. So this could be body. Really, the entire content of this is either going to be one big WYSIWYG body field. It's a fine way to go, or something a little bit more structured. We would often build something using the paragraphs module, which lets you have a more highly designed method of putting a page together. That's probably less appropriate for a hobbyist or intro level site, and more for something that is going to be have more theme development behind it, because you're not going to get great support for the appearance unless you spend some time with CSS and templates to make paragraphs look nice. But I'm just putting that there as an option. Let's see, other things that I see on this site right now. Okay, so I see, whenever I see a word that's plural, that makes me wonder, is this a type of content? in this case, I'm thinking probably that's a maybe. um,
In this case, it would be a yes, but I don't think that was pre-thought out very well. It just turns out.
yeah, so a ministry could be a piece of a type of content if they all have something in common. And then that's the question. Do these have something in common about them that sets them apart from a basic page?
You
So
want me to answer that?
yeah, if you have an answer, go ahead.
Well, I think I can give you a broad answer to it. Yes, they do. And the thing that they have in common is they are various service functions from within the church.
Right.
In other words, you could even think of them as organizations, sub-organizations within the church structure itself, designed to be of service.
Okay, so possibly a ministry
Mhm.
is a thing.
Mhm.
This is a particular outreach
It is a miscellany of
miscellany. Okay.
it was intended originally to be a miscellany of current events,
Okay.
things that have just been going on.
Okay.
And the
We have
wood
a
shop is
blog.
not a good example of that, by the way.
Okay.
Try the enjoyment.
Oh, we have a blog that is not
It's not,
not
yeah,
active.
could never get anybody interested in using it.
So
That's
that would
about
be
the age of the congregation.
right. Sure. So that would be something to consider. It wouldn't be hard to implement if you wanted to have it, but it would be, you know, in the evaluation, we'd think maybe we don't need that.
I still think that's a great idea to implement it, but tell them that. Sorry for the sad comment.
And, contact us. There's an out-of-the-box contact form that could be used there, or you'd be using the web form module, but this is probably not a content type. Probably just basic pages for things like the map. Calendar. Now this looks like something that is more functionality heavy. So I'm going to write this in here as an event. Now, there are two obvious avenues that come to mind for me here. One is make an event content type that would have on it minimally a date and description, and then use a calendar module to display those. There are some like calendar simply that could be installed to produce effectively what we're seeing here. You could also implement this with the events themselves. It's not uncommon that a calendar for an organization like this needs to be something that drives other things in the organization. In which case, doing something like Google Calendar with a plugin to display the calendar on a basic page would be a very common solution as well. Either one is fine. Depends on what you're doing with these. Do you know?
We simply opted to not share with Google or anyone else that does that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. So these, right. It looks like right now this is handled with a normal event module or event content type. So it will be similar to that to produce an output like this. This might actually be an older version of that same module that I just showed. And then you've got a members only section that presumably would have a login to it. I don't know if that's something you're still envisioning.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think yes, because there are certain things that the membership feels should be kept secure from general public, but should be available to the members themselves.
So far, we've seen 3 things that I would put in that last bucket of custom functionality. So we've talked about some content we're capturing. So probably there would then be, are those the private things, are those mostly files, or is it
Um,
information?
yes, they are. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we might, one way of doing that, a nice way of handling that um, might be to say that we have a private file that is a content type.
Mhm.
This means, so I'm going to say that both this one and this one are examples of content that only makes sense to make the content type for if you have the functionality to drive it. And so those are things where we would need a third-party module to handle that. So we already talked about calendar for this one. And then for the private file, we would do something like node permissions by role, or one of the content permission modules to drive that. Let's see. So then we had, so events would probably drive things like this block on the home page. We'd use that same information. So I see here, this is telling me weekly services tells me that probably a service should also be a content type.
Mm-hmm.
Because each one has the same things. Each one has a bulletin and each one has a service video. So that is what is going to cue me into thinking that we need to have a thing called a service, which has a date and it has bulletin, etc. That allows you to make a listing of those very easily without any custom module to drive that. Okay. This looks like this is a newsletter.
It's a monthly, yes. Yes, it basically is.
Probably you would want a piece of content for, or a content type for that as well, because again, it's not just a file. It is something that recurs in a predictable way and would have the same fields each time.
That's
So,
accurate.
yeah. So
By the way, some of the content dates on there you may notice are kind of out of date. Normally they are kept up to date, but our church secretary who does some of that for us is currently recovering from the COVID. She hasn't been functioning for
yeah.
about 3 weeks.
All right. So that would have the date and the download itself. Probably a summary for, I'm not trying to go into all the details here. We would try to list out more of those. So far on this site, I haven't come across too much that are pieces of content that relate to one another. So I think the next thing is, Jack, tell me what other things that you think should be here that aren't.
What I think should be here is the ability to, as I indicated, if nothing else, I think the front page, the home page, should be driven by the specifics behind it, by some of the content that you've already described. And I think it should be driven by what's current about that content, by and large.
Yeah, so a homepage is an interesting thing to talk about because it's a black sheet of a site in so many ways. So what we're probably getting into is for someone who's attempting to build a site mostly through configuration as opposed to code, ideally, we're going to be building things like the homepage out of views.
Yes,
So
I think so.
yeah, the tricky part is that views We'll do some great things like for the event, the calendar. I'm gonna what can I use for let's say a parallelogram. Obviously looks like a view to me. Okay, so we've got a oh, that's what that does. There we go. Okay, so we would make a calendar view of events. Now, that calendar module, what that actually does is it creates a view display handler that is a monthly calendar. But we could also have keep trying to use shortcuts that don't exist on this web-based tool. I could also have the upcoming events block. That's a different view of the same content, or a different display of that same view, probably.
Jonathan, there's an example at the bottom of the current home page of something that I don't know that we've got adequately covered, and that's a very specific announcement. I frequently get email requests from people saying, could you put this on the website? I mean, that's about as specific as it gets. And yeah, that you've got it right there. That is something, the kind of thing I'd like to be able to put in fairly frequently and easily. And I think it might represent a separate content type. I'm not sure.
I think that makes a whole lot of sense.
Volatile. It's not the kind of thing that I think we'd store forever and ever and ever on the website anyway.
So it has an expiration date, perhaps?
It could well have, yeah. And whether or not it fits one of the other content categories is not obvious to me. I don't see it myself, but it may be there.
Yep. So we would have something down here that says active announcements. And then that would point there. We would have latest. So I'm not going to bother drawing all of these, but this is the kind of the idea for this exercise.
Right.
We would then say we would need a view for the latest Carillon issue. We would need a separate view for all of them chronologically. That would be a page. So we have a block for the home page and a page for the, and when you're building views, we're not going to go into the details of that today, but Views has a nice feature where you can start. Good strategy there is the same thing that we were talking about, where we're going to go bottom up with our architecture. We can go bottom up with our view. So you start with making a view of the detail page. So it'll be the listing of all of the issues of your newsletter.
Mm-hmm.
And then in views, you can say, I would like another display of this same view. And this one will be a block, and it will inherit most of the things from the other one, but you can say, but limit it to the most recent. Okay. So that would be appropriate for these issues. It would work perfectly for the services. So, so this site really is going to lend itself very well to a lot of chronologically driven content.
Some of the other secure content that we have on the site, Jonathan, are things such as a membership listing, individual information about people, birthdays, home addresses, email addresses, those kinds of things.
Yes.
Exactly where that fits as I'm looking at this isn't real obvious to me. I don't know if we need another content type or not. And maybe I'm getting into more detail than you want to go into.
No, I think that's a, oops.
It's kind of another category of stuff, if you will.
So that's interesting. So the member directory could be done by two ways, and this is something that comes up on a lot of our sites that we'll have this question. So a piece of content that maybe is a user and maybe is a node. And that's a decision that would have to be made.
Yes.
So anything that is a person tends to fall into that question.
Yes.
And the decision you need to make is, does it make sense? Can you make this statement that each of these people will have a one-to-one relationship to a user account? And for some sites, you can totally make that assumption, but then for others, you have cases where, well, we really want information on this person, but they're not going to log in. Or I could see on a church site, you might have a record for a family as opposed to for a person, in
Absolutely.
which case.
Absolutely. And that's the way we handle our member directory right now, but it's not at all user friendly. And I hate to use that well-worked term, but anyway, in this particular case, we would like for members to be able to update their own information. And when it gets
Right.
into a family, it gets really, really messy the way it was designed. I don't happen to believe it has to be that way, but it is.
Right.
And I
So
never even suggest to anybody that they try to update their own information because it's
yeah. When you're talking about, so we already are talking about private files, which is the most complicated thing that you're doing out of all of these
I
things.
think that's true.
Oh, and actually, that's a different issue. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. So this one could be a user, or it could be family as a content type.
Correct.
With users that can edit them.
Yeah, it would be nice to think of each one. I was gonna give you a simplistic answer to your user question about the one-to-one relationship, but you really can't do that with children in a family. It just doesn't work well.
Right. So what you're left with is, does a family share an account?
Yes.
Which.
And I think the answer is probably yes on that.
Could work.
In our case. In a general case, I don't know.
In the general case, more than one person sharing a password is always sketchy.
I see, you're right.
I mean, if we're thinking about this in the general case of, we did a school website where, okay, we're gonna have one account per family. Okay, these parents got divorced.
Yeah, there you go.
So now what?
Right.
Planning for complicated situations up front is not fun, but usually easier than retrofitting them later.
Yes.
And so the cleanest architecture I can think of is to have a user not being the same as a family, but rather have one or more users able to edit a family. This is something, yeah, Ellen.
Yeah, I have a question about that, about how you would accomplish that, because restricting access to editing is tricky, because usually the solution is that you would restrict it to whoever is the author of that content, and you can't have multiple authors to a node, last I checked.
Yes, you are correct. Yeah, and so Ellen's got it on the nose. So
this is a question that I'm really interested in, because it's actually a problem I'm trying to solve for my project too. So because we have bands and multiple artists in a band, and who gets to edit the information of that band, right? Like,
and possibly an artist that is in multiple bands. I could really see. So you would want a relationship. So the thing, here's what's clear. We would need a member that is a user. Why don't we use this example again? And we would want a family. Oops, I didn't press the right button. There it is. Okay, so This could be done a couple different ways, but I think the more obvious way to do it is to have the family. No. Have the family point to the member. And so that there's a multi-valued relationship there. Then there needs to be something that restricts access to this family. Now, I bet there is a module that does this that I am not aware of.
With the number of modules out there, that wouldn't be surprising.
And this gets into that last thing that I said we wouldn't have time for today, which is vetting modules. So there is nothing out of the box that will do this. I can tell you that. I could write this code pretty quickly, which makes me think that there is something out there that does it already. But basically, we would make a field on the family node that points to all of the members. And then there would be some code with a hook that that checks to see whether you have permissions to edit. So let's see. Modules only. Node edit permissions. So anyway, I guess I don't have time to actually do this search live. But this is actually something that I like. I like this as a topic, and I will either post this as a follow-up to today's meetup, or this will be the editing strategies for editing and viewing permissions on content could be a whole topic. So I'm going to put a pin in this one, but we will revisit this. So if I can get you a quick answer, I will post it as a follow-up on this meeting. Otherwise, it will be a whole meeting in and of itself, handling that editing question. So the simple solution that is not as flexible would be to either make the family a user object itself. You can do views of those just fine, or to have it be a separate thing, but make the author of this be the individual member who has the rights to do the editing. And then the problem is solved. So
unless you want multiple editors.
As soon as you want multiple editors, things get more complicated. So that's going to be the thing that I'm going to follow up in one of those two ways. So since we're coming to the conclusion here, one more thing that came to mind that I realized after the fact I didn't quite do correctly in this is that this issue, and possibly even the service, although I don't think so. No, okay, not the service. This Carillon issue is really just something that's wrapping a PDF. It's some metadata about a PDF. So that is almost certainly a media entity, not a node. So you could make, so media can have fields just like nodes can. They can be in listings just like nodes can. The difference is that they have a representation as something that is downloaded or viewed. They have, and this Carillon issue feels like that to me. So I probably would build that as a media type instead of a content type.
That makes sense to me.
The service doesn't fit that because the service has a couple different downloads. It doesn't have one representation. That's not going to make a big difference in the big scheme of things, but I just wanted to call that as another item of consideration when you're coming up with this array of stuff on your site.
Mm-hmm.
So we are out of time, but I'm hoping that this is a helpful view of how you could attack some of these questions, of, how do you look at a site and map it onto the things in Drupal? And we can follow this up certainly with some more in-depth views of, I think the editing permissions question is a great one, that we can go into in quite a bit of depth. But even things like figuring out what fields to put on a piece of content, that's probably the next step. So this would give you enough to build some very basic content types, but you're gonna have to put fields on those, and we can talk through some of that. But I think this is a snapshot of how we do it. Any quick questions before I click stop on the record?
No, to me, that was really helpful, Jonathan.
Oh, good.
Very
Good.
helpful.
I'm glad.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. That's good. I didn't, well, I guess the whole history behind like the first, some of the first different entity types, that was kind of cool to think about, because like, I know of like what's existed since Drupal 7.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, I wonder just like how different it probably was,
Yeah, there's a lot of baggage that's still there, even though some of it's so much cleaner, but names are a thing that it's hard to shake.
Mhm. Yeah.
I have a general question, John. Am I interrupting you all?
No.
Oh, no, not at all.
I have a general question. In migrating this site, which is in Drupal 7 that we've been using there, the church site, migrating that to 8 or 9, what is your first impression of the best way to do it, considering a few of the comments that we've made? Would you be inclined to practically redesign it, or to migrate it as is and try to modify, blah, blah, blah?
I would almost certainly build a new empty Drupal site and then try to migrate the content into that, as opposed to trying to migrate any of the configuration.
Okay, thank you. That answers my question clearly.
Yeah, that's very doable. You can map old fields to new fields just for the parts that, like you'd probably write a new about page, those basic things.
Right.
But for all of your old archive events, and you can bring those over with your migration process.
I didn't realize that you would have described it as very doable. To me, it sounds very tricky. That's my level of competence in it.
Yeah.
For migrations right now, because I've been like, not super involved with Drupal development for a while. And so what is the state of Drupal 9 if I'm gonna migrate a site? Like, I'm looking through and I'm seeing like, contributed modules. I don't see a lot of them with Drupal 9 releases. And so I'm trying to figure out, okay, are people migrating already to 9, or is that not?
We are not yet developing in 9. We're
Okay.
developing in 8 with 9 readiness in mind. Okay. So we're making sure that all of our code that we write passes all the Drupal 9 tests, but we're not actually switching over to 9 until a couple critical third-party modules are released. Actually, the one we're waiting for is almost there. It's web form.
Web form, okay, yeah.
It's the biggest blocker. Once that's there, we'll be pretty much good to go on switching over to 9. So we just want to make sure that we're not the holdup when all the other blockers go away. But yeah, developing for 8 or 9 is still the same at this point. There are no new features in 9 we're missing. It's just a little faster.
Yeah, so because I was looking at my project requirements and thinking, because I have to migrate a Drupal 7 site. And if I were to migrate it today, I guess then I would be migrating to Drupal 8 because there's not really, I was looking through the different requirements I had, and I'm like, well, I need this module and this module. Web form is on there of like some of the requirements I have. So
there is no migration from 8 to 9. It's just an update.
Right.
So yeah, you migrate to the latest 8 and you'll be in good shape.
You just answered one of my questions. That's really true. Huh? I'm picking that up from the, from the Drupal PR, but.
Yes.
are you
The only
finding
difference
that-
between 8 and 9 is that things have been removed that
Okay.
are obsolete. Nothing new has been added yet.
Hasn't the
And
core
shouldn't-
been
Oh,
been
sorry.
added too?
Nothing. Yeah, only things have only been removed from core. All the updates have been applied to 8 as well.
Wonderful.
So,
And I shouldn't go naming my new project _8.
a year is a fairly safe suffix probably, but even that is a little risky.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all for your for participating. As I said, I will post this recording on the meetup page, so
Please.
review that later. And we've brought up some great topics that hopefully I can recruit someone else to take the helm on. But the next one sounds like it's the user permissions issue, because that's a very interesting one that goes in lots of different directions.
Jonathan, did you want to continue using that Fremont FCC website for further amplification as you move forward?
I mean, it's probably not the only one we'll use, because we'll find some good other good examples, but I think yeah.
Okay, my follow-up question was going to be, would it be helpful to you if we unlocked it?
I think you can tell us if there are things relevant to whatever topics we're talking about that are behind the.
There could be. I see it as, I can tell you that nothing jumps out at me, but on the other hand, it might jump out